Newsflash. Democracy is good for your businesses.
We are looking for sponsors to help the only outlet who is looking at Chinese algorithmic progress in English. If you'd like to be able to put tighter error bars around where you think the future of Chinese algorithms are going, please reach out. Jordan at ChinaTalk.media. I'd love to connect.
This may be the only third-party red teaming exercise of Chinese models that exists out there. So it's very much worth supporting, y'all.
Top 5 U.S.-China tech stories of 2023. I have the great Kevin Xu, longtime China Talk guest and creator of the Interconnected Substack, which you can find at interconnect.substack.com.
Thank you so much for having me back, Jordan.
Oh, what a treat.
As always. I remember the last time I got on this show, we were still talking about whether TikTok will be banned or at least.
All right, so let's start with my number 5 then. Temu's rise and TikTok continuing to chug along. So, the last show we did was in the wake of the big congressional hearing where the TikTok CEO had this like really awkward performance, which I think has only been exceeded now by the Harvard and Penn presidents
Good Lord.
being dragged in front of Congress. But in spite of that, both of us were really calling that moment as a sort of real turning point and like death knell for any Chinese tech firm having ambitions in the US. But somehow we've like entered the timeline whereas in December of 2023 we still have TikTok growing at like double-digit percentage a year. Temu, of course, Pinduoduo's sort of like product that they brought to the US, which is group buying. You get like 10 bras for $4 or totally insane things, has grown so big that like Amazon is starting to get scared and think their take rate on cheap stuff on Amazon, such that maybe we were actually wrong in calling it so early that the sort of momentum that you initially saw both out of the executive and legislative branches would end up amounting to real regulatory restrictions on what Chinese tech firms can do in the US.
That's right. I mean, I think we probably gave our congressional legislators too much credit, as in like translating C-SPAN outrage into real action. I do think there are other interesting, probably like under the radar currents when it comes to who is pulling the strings to keep TikTok around. There's obviously a lot of outrage continuously around why TikTok is bad for the United States for a bunch of reasons. But at the end of the day, if you look at their cap table, one of their largest and earliest investor is, one of the founders of Susquehanna, Jeffrey Yass, who is a massive donor and a, lifelong libertarian, for lack of a better label, really pulling the strings on a bunch of different congressional, members. This was reported in the Wall Street Journal, I think, a few months ago, where at the end of the day, there's enough vested commercial interest in TikTok or ByteDance in general continuing to do what it does, that it's just not going to be that easy. And our political, attention span is basically the same as a goldfish. So we just kind of moved on. And in the same bucket, really, we had the Restrict Act. I don't know if you remember that one. That also gained a lot of attention and, frankly, a lot of political support from the White House. It was a bipartisan proposal. I think you had Senator Mark Warner on your show to talk about it. And that also kind of fizzled out, at least for now. And really something to watch out for next year is if these high attention, high profile proposals or desires get rekindle, let's just say, in election year, and whether that actually becomes action or just another issue to campaign around. My number 5, we're clearly, skirting the obvious topic until later on in the show, but my story number 5 is Splinter VC, is the actual physical breaking up of cross-border VC firms, more specifically Sequoia and also GGV Capital. There's probably a few others that I thought would also have done the same because of their setup, but they haven't, like Lightspeed and Redpoint and, Kleiner. These are all firms that have sort of like presence, right, in both countries. And you were talking about stuff that didn't happen, right? TikTok is still around. One thing that did happen is the splitting up of these global VC firms because of their affiliation and their actual portfolio in China that are now considered basically on the naughty list, if you will, of the US government. And this is a real tangible impact. I think we talk a lot about de-risking, decoupling, all the different variations of the relationship. This is probably one of the examples where it physically feels like there is now a wall in something that is quite frankly as fluid as capital, as money, which usually in a free market society just flows to wherever the opportunity is. And right now, obviously, that is not the case when it comes to cross-border venture investing. And it also sets up all these interesting kind of frenemy relationships now, where the formerly Sequoia China, now renamed Hongshan, which is still the word for Sequoia in Chinese, is everywhere in the US, right? Looking for deals, talking to founders, mostly of Chinese descent, as a way to still do their business, especially since the Chinese VC market in general is actually in a bit of a downward spiral, or really like not doing so well. So you have all these kind of interesting kind of cross-border relationship, but very much manifested in a different way. So that's my number 5 as far as something that did happen, but most people might have already forgotten at this point.
So let's pour one out for U.S. dollar-based VC investing in China. Kevin, you want to give like a little retrospective on the sort of like highs and lows and impact that we've seen over the past 20 years of these flows?
Well, I mean, I think it's very clear that China's we'll just stick with the tech sector, right? And I would say particularly the internet sector and everything that came out of that has made a lot of money for a lot of Chinese LPs, as well as U.S. endowments and large pension funds, Canadian pension funds, probably even a few of the Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds. So that is something that has been an obvious trend to bet on for the last, I would say, 15 years or so. And it's very, very unclear where that is going in the next 20 years. And that is an uncertainty, right, that we are heading into in the next few years or so, because I think there is a huge shift as far as what is favorable now in the Chinese tech market when it comes to what will get more investment dollars. Clearly, we're focusing on the harder tech side of things when it comes to manufacturing, obviously with semiconductors, but also everything that comes around when it comes to AI, but also advanced manufacturing, electric vehicles. So it's just a very different tone at this point. And the way that American VCs have always been doing business, which the Chinese VCs have done a very good job of both adapting and I think evolving in its own market to its own success, is clearly coming to an end.
So my number 4 is the Chinese EV explosion. China is just beating the entire world by leaps and bounds, sans Tesla, on scaling production and deployment of electric vehicles. And without it's like a pairwise story, because you also see everyone besides Tesla just like not getting it or not figuring it out, and you have this sort of innovator's dilemma with like the long tail of Japanese, South Korean, and American, German producers who I don't know, maybe have just like too much of coding debt, or the equivalent for that with like
tech debt, tech debt,
have too much like internal combustion tech debt that they can't work themselves through. And watching this play out, the sort of political response is, was just beginning with the IRA and some of the policies coming out of the EU, but it'll start to crest, I think, in the next year or two when imports really start to be, particularly in Europe, start to be a real thing. And the decision point that Europe that is going to have to make on whether or not they're comfortable having, tens, hundreds of thousands, even millions of cars be, Chinese electric vehicles sold into their countries is something that will be really interesting to watch play out over the coming year.
Yeah, that's one of my top 5s as well, right? I think part of the growth, the global kind of dominance in Chinese EV is one because the domestic market has been very much supported, right, from the top to the bottom, but there is a bit of a demand softening inside the Chinese market, right? If you have the chance to go to China this year, it's relatively easy now. Get a visa, just go. It's really not that hard. You see just a lot more green plates on the street, almost wherever you go. And they are a bunch of different domestic brands, not just Tesla, which is the only kind of foreign EV that still has a decent, market share in China. But that demand is probably not going to be accelerating as much as it used to. So obviously, a lot of these Chinese EV makers need to go abroad. Europe is a very willing market, I think, for the most part, but we'll see if they come up with different, regulations to push Chinese makers out in the same way that I think the U.S. has already done so, right? Whether it's through like IRA credits or tariffs and whatnot. And the one thing that I think is also interesting in this bilateral kind of U.S. China competition when it comes to EV is there's quite a bit of action, I think, in my opinion, in the U.S. We're shooting ourselves in the foot, right? I think Ford has probably got some decent momentum when it comes to battery collaboration with Korean battery makers, certainly licensing CATL's technology for its Marquis, Michigan battery plant has kind of like gathered some controversy, but that really would have happened regardless, if not for, I think, the UAW labor strike that just significantly increased the cost of making cars in general in the US. But certainly as all these, as the Detroit Big Three are converting or trying to transition into EVs, it's becoming less and less tenable. And you can make up all kinds of excuses as far as like, oh, Americans just don't like EVs. Americans like our gas guzzlers. We like our road trips, so on and so forth. But I think everything that Tesla has been doing is really pushing back on that narrative with real sales and real adoption. It's just that none of the kind of the traditional national champions in America are really getting their shit together. They have a pretty bad hand that they've dealt as far as like labor agreements concerned. We'll see if UAW will be keeping on their organizing kind of victory streak to even extend into Tesla or Toyota battery plants and other EV plants. I think those are all on the table as part of the negotiation win from the union side. And that's just not a setup that's making something that's already hard for U.S. automakers now even harder. And I think the end result will be none of us will be able to get our hands on an EV F-150. But we also can't get a Neo or a Xiaopeng because they're just not allowed to come in here,
Yeah. A sort of parallel story to the Chinese EV explosion is like the dramatic successes you started to see out of Chinese commercial space, which was, and like, they're basically only being SpaceX on the other side, which, has also, figured out how to launch Starship, which is sort of incredible. But, sans SpaceX, the U.S. would be in a really weird place when it comes to the future of launch. But China seems to have a sort of, less advanced, but like more broad-based and healthier ecosystem. There are a number of companies that have figured out how to do their own reusable launch, and I think there's, also international ambitions around that too. So. It would have been great if like the one tycoon keeping American industrial ambitions alive like didn't happen to be a horrific human being, but it is really remarkable that it's kind of like two firms against like two entire Chinese ecosystems at play right now, and I don't know what that says about Elon or about the stultification of American capitalism or what have you. But it's it is very striking that you have such sort of like vibrant and maybe like over exuberant competition in China domestically, whereas in the U.S. It is much more sort of stultified, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, on the EV front specifically, right? I think there's probably like a volume surplus at this point on the Chinese side, while there's clearly a volume deficit on the American side. And we haven't even talked about the infrastructure side of building charging stations, all these sort of very basic elements of electrification that frankly should be happening with or without which, cars or EVs are going to be on the street in the US. And that is unfortunately just not happening.
All right, Kevin, let's get all our non-chips AI ones out of the way. What else you got?
Okay, so my number 3 is Pinduoduo taking over Alibaba's market cap. This may feel more like a China ecosystem kind of specific story, right? For those of you who haven't been tracking the public market as closely, Pinduoduo being kind of the e-commerce, a new kid on the block, now juggernaut, has officially taken over Alibaba in terms of their stock prices, their market capitalization. And that just happened within the last couple of weeks or so. And it's been a huge deal, certainly within Alibaba, who has been going through a really rough year of massive corporate reorganization, breaking the company up into 6 different pieces, wanting to IPO or absorb additional funding for any of those 6 pieces, and then canceling one of the most prominent ones being Alibaba Cloud, while Pinduoduo is just heads down doing their thing, cranking out more referral codes and selling more, cheap stuff on their very attractive, sticky app, not to mention the growth of team. And I think this is worth noting because we've done, everyone who is vaguely interested in China has been guessing so much about how the Chinese economy is doing, how is it not doing, is it opening up, why is it not opening up more, so on and so forth. I think the rise of Pinduoduo, which very much has just honed the buyer persona of getting deals, social buying, really kind of I think reflects the mood of consumerism in China, which is that luxury buying is cool, but right now we're just in a bit of a tough environment after 3 years of COVID lockdown, where we're going to buy affordable things. And we still enjoy shopping. We enjoy the entertainment of shopping, but it's Pinduoduo that's really kind of engineered and designed for that consumer persona that's becoming more pervasive. And as long as you design for that, you can still do really, really well as a company and as a platform. So in a way, it's a bit of a nuanced take on where the consumer is in China and where the spending is going to manifest.
Okay. All right. So we're down to our top 2. I have chip war number 1 and algorithmic and sort of like AI model competition number 2. So everyone's heard all my takes on this. Kevin, what's your diagnosis of the sort of AI competition?
So I'll start with the AI stuff first, right? I think there are a few things that are worth remembering. One is that China has been very efficient, I say, in both proposing and actually rolling out the generative AI related regulations into the wild, right? This basically happened in the course of a few months. April, there was an initial proposal. July, it became an initial set of actual policies having industry intake. And then I think October, there was an additional set of red teaming restrictions that are being proposed as well in terms of keeping AI safe, quote unquote, as far as like releasing real products from every company in China is concerned. So that is the one that, quite frankly, if you compare that to all the other major jurisdictions, the US, EU, and other countries, no one country has been as quick. I'm not saying it's good. I'm just saying it's quick, it's efficient, like it's out there, right? It's being implemented. And the other element of that, this is a little bit related to the BC stuff, is there is a 100 model war, right, going on in the Chinese tech ecosystem initially this year after ChatGPT kind of took over the mindshare of everybody in the tech space. And now it's like whittling down to a few different models and startups that are actually going to survive. But there was a lot of kind of like so-called like Juan behavior for the first half of this year, where every tech company under the sun done in China is try to make their own models. So that is something that is evolving. And the last thing that I will just highlight is the blocking of Hugging Face, which China Talk has done some good writing on that I suggest people go read. And Hugging Face, for those of you who are not familiar, is a open source, or it's a developer platform where people kind of like share, collaborate on, train, test AI models, very similar to GitHub, which is where most of the open source code is being collaborated on. And the GitHub is technically not blocked in China, but Hugging Face at this moment is blocked in China. And that has created, I wouldn't say an uproar, but certainly a lot of angst and anxiety in China among the developer community, who is actually trying to catch up to US models and US AI pace of development, but not having access to this dominant open platform has created a lot of productivity losses and uncertain future, which I think does not bode well for China's own kind of generative AI progress, with or without any additional more stringent sanctions on the semiconductor GPU front.
So I think there's one way to sort of look at all of the AI algorithmic restrictions that the Chinese government is putting on and blocking of Hugging Face, and adding that up to like China, making it a lot harder on its developers to sort of ganchao to catch up and surpass the Western models, which I'm sure is probably true. These have to be drags, but I do think it has been really remarkable to me personally just how good these Chinese models have gotten. China Talk on the newsletter, ChinaTalk.media, which you guys should all subscribe to. We just spent a lot of time internally with myself and other editors on the team playing around with some of the top Chinese models, with Kimi, Ernie, ChatGLM2, and they're not GPT-4 level, but they're like months behind, not years behind. And I sort of feel them as like slightly more or less indistinguishable from Bard, maybe a little worse than Claude, definitely probably worse than Claude 2.1, but I think there was a sort of expectation in the development AI safety policy community broadly that like China would actually have a difficult time, at least in the near term, being able to sort of catch up. And maybe these firms would have to resort to like stealing OpenAI's weights or something in order to create comparable products. But like, to my mind, to my eyes at least, like that does not seem to be the case. And today's the sort of talent within the PRC and the amount of compute that these engineers are able to get at and the data sources that they've been able to collect and train on, like, are roughly enough to continue to be fast followers to the best that the West can offer, at least into the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing where I read that piece, and it's really a fantastic piece, by the way. I really enjoyed it. One thing that I may differ with your impression when it comes to China's AI progress, let's just say, from a model perspective, is that I don't think the sanctions that are really going to hurt have actually manifested itself yet. Because another story, right, this year is that because of the October 2022 sanction, not talking about this year's, all the Chinese big vendors have been very aggressive and on the ball for the most part in stockpiling as much to be sanctioned chips from NVIDIA, whether it's the A100s or the modified H800s. And a lot of the US models that we've seen in the wild are still being trained on the A100s, I believe, for the most part, or like derivatives of that. So the difference in terms of benchmarking when it comes to the hardware that is still accessible, I think that explains why I think a lot of the models that you've tested out on the Chinese side are still comparable, right, to maybe like the third or the fourth best models in the US. I think that difference, assuming the sanctions of this year are being strictly enforced, will show up as far as the pace of development starting next year. right? That's when all the H100s right now being sold, being made, and actually being racked are going to really come online for the next generation of Gemini or GPT 567 or Claude, whatever that may be. So next year it will be interesting to see how well will Kimi or Ernie or Yi or all these other Chinese models will be able to keep up when they will have to start swapping out domestic alternatives from Huawei, for example, because they cannot even get their hands on maybe the H20s, which is the latest, modified NVIDIA product. So that is a TBD for me. I think a lot of these benchmarks can be gamed at the end of the day. That's just what, people do when it comes to marketing in infrastructure technology, right? There's a term called benchmarking that everybody does. That is just very pervasive. And I will just say the other thing, too, that makes me a little bit still pessimistic about the Chinese AI scene is that because of the regulations that we're talking about, which I believe places quite a bit of compliance hurdle on the release of any new model, let alone the applications that you can build on top of model. I think there's a bunch of registration and compliance steps that you have to go on or to have to jump through before you can even release a product, that there will be there'll be a lot less product feedback from the wild. And I think that really kind of strangles progress more so than we give it credit for. Like the way ChatGPT was released a year ago, which literally is just like a blog post, here, check it out on Twitter, would be unthinkable in the Chinese regulatory ecosystem, right? Mm-hmm. And that just like puts you back in so many different ways from a iterative improvement perspective.
You very well may be right, particularly on the sort of 2025, 2026 horizon.
Yeah, I just think there's a lagging indicator or a lagging effect, not to use Fed speak. There's a lagging effect of the chip sanctions that we still haven't actually felt yet, even though folks like you and me keep on top of the latest policy developments. These things kind of don't manifest itself in the actual production and the selling cycle until a couple of years from now, right?
But then the real question is whether they'll matter, because Huawei will just be able to make their own chips and not necessarily rely on NVIDIA for the hardware. But before we get to our number one topic, or I guess Kevin's number two, I do want to come back to this this human preference evaluation that we did in China Talk. This took a ton of work, and there is so much more to be done. We ended up having to narrow our scope really dramatically, only picking a few models, only doing like 100 prompts per model, and focusing on more basic things that we could evaluate relatively quickly, which is basically like office worker type stuff. Not delving into the potentially more impactful things like code performance and what have you. So we are looking for sponsors to help the only outlet who is looking at the Chinese algorithmic progress in English. So if you are out there and think that this research is important, if you'd like to be able to put tighter error bars around where you think the future of Chinese algorithms are going, please reach out. Jordan at ChinaTalk.media. I'd love to connect and explore how we could potentially work together. All right.
Yes. Definitely do that. I want to echo that before we move on, because this may be the only third-party red teaming exercise of Chinese models that exists out there. So it's very much worth supporting, y'all.
Thank you, Kevin. All right. Number one story, Huawei breakthrough plus October 7th revised. Kevin, take it away.
What I think is interesting, because it's a top story, is that it grabs so much attention. Yet, I think for everyone who is kind of in the industry, I don't even count myself as one of those, to be honest. But the Huawei breakthrough, this is a 7-nanometer chip that is completely homemade in China between Huawei and SMIC, the domestic chip foundry that went into Huawei's latest smartphone, the Mate 60 Pro, has been anticipated and not so much a surprise, quite frankly, for anyone who just understands how this stuff works from a process improvement perspective. I think Jensen Huang, who went on the DealBook New York Times forum a few days days ago when he was asked this question, basically shrugged it off and be like, yeah, I mean, no one in the industry is surprised. Like, this will happen. Like, it's it's a known process to be able to squeeze what you can out of your existing DUV equipment if you try hard enough with a big enough order and a big enough customer, which is Huawei, to push you to do so. And this basically happened, and no one should be surprised this is happened. I don't know how much it will happen, but 7 nanometer, in his words, it's just a number. It's just like this thing that we have as far as like a benchmark is concerned in the chip fabrication industry, and we probably place way too much attention to the nanometer count, and not enough attention, quite frankly, to the innovation that needs to go into keeping this momentum going on the Huawei side, and what the US should do or can do to delay that sort of inevitable progress, as opposed to maybe spending more of our attention and money in the US to keep on advancing our own capabilities. So that's sort of like my take on this particular news item. Now, I think there's some interesting sort of like high level geopolitical, almost like personal side to it. I think, Huawei's timing of releasing the phone to coincide with our Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo's visit to China has certainly got under her skin.
All right,
and
let's stop there. I'm going to
Okay.
insert a 2-minute sort of clip video that I made of Secretary Raimondo's speech at the Reagan National Defense Forum from a few days ago, early in December.
Huawei's new smartphone that was released a couple of months ago to know
When
that
I was
they're-
in China.
Yes. Oh, look at that.
Thank you very much. We have to get smarter about what are the technologies, which are just where we are ahead of China. They're capable of doing very bad things, and we're going to deny the entire country this class of equipment. We can't let China get these chips. Period. Period. Listen, America leads the world in artificial intelligence. Period. Full stop. We're a couple of years ahead of China. No way are we going to let them catch up. We cannot let them catch up. So we're going to deny them our most cutting edge technology. Is the industry on board? I mean, yes, but they're in the business of making money. Every time I take an action, it denies them revenue. My own view is that industry, newsflash, democracy is good for your businesses. Rule of law here and around the world is good for your businesses. So it might make for a tough quarterly shareholder call, but in the long run, it's worth you working with us to defend our country's national security.
We're talking a lot about chips. Are there other U.S. origin products or types of technologies that you are looking at in a similar fashion right now?
Absolutely. In biotechnology, AI models, AI products, cloud computing, supercomputing. So short answer is yes. I would say communication is a good thing, but don't confuse communication with weakness or softness. On matters of national security, we got to be eyes wide open about the threat. This is the biggest threat we've ever had. And we need to meet the moment. The world needs us to manage our relationship with China responsibly to avoid escalation. We got to do all that, but make no mistake about it. China's not our friend, and we need to be eyes wide open about the extent of that threat. I am ready to win, and I'm ready to do that with all of you, but it's time to open our aperture and challenge the way we've done business in every way if we're going to meet the threat China poses and if we're going to do what needs to be done with this technology.
So coming back to this clip, and I feel like she is clearly very triggered in a lot of ways. I think that performance on stage at the Reagan National Defense Forum was very, there was a lot of anger towards NVIDIA in particular. There was clearly a lot of anger towards Huawei. The anger towards NVIDIA, I think, is probably the one I find most troubling, in the sense that she basically told NVIDIA that all the kind of workarounds that NVIDIA has been doing to be compliant but still be able to do business in China is quote unquote not productive, when that is just what companies do. And she, on the one hand, celebrated the innovation of U.S. Technology being mostly a private sector accomplishment, and on the other hand, kind of almost critiquing them for just doing what they're doing. I think is very troubling. We'll see what she will actually do in terms of her actual action. There's this hilarious observation now, the so-called Raimondo law, which is the observation that the restrictions placed on the U.S. AI chips will expand at regular intervals, which is kind of a derivative joke on the Moore's law. I think that's actually becoming a real possibility as long as Secretary Raimondo remains Secretary Raimondo. So that is something that I think, to me, as a free market, capitalist, is actually quite troubling.
Yeah, the sort of weirdest thing about that, and I think it, maybe there's some also frustration directed at her boss, which is that she was like, look, if companies are just gonna, dip right under the letter of the law when it comes to the regulation, like, we'll ban it the next day. And as we talked about on China Talk, they could have done that. The H800 was around for a really long time. It's not that hard to send a letter saying we're going to ban this and then ban it before an entire year of your like really extended OODA loop ends up sort of being able to work itself through its system. And I think, it's unclear what was driving that. Was that Biden, telling every cabinet secretary to sort of chill out to make sure that APEC was able to happen? And I guess like World War III doesn't start compared, if that's your sort of like theory of the case. So, I wonder exactly sort of, to what extent the sort of like operating space that she and BIS have been under from both a corporate pressure perspective, as well as a let's get the U.S.-China relationship right perspective, has been constraining her ability to really execute and quote unquote win, as she very dramatically focused on. Was driving some of the sort of emotive power of her remarks, and to what extent this is portentous of future controls. We heard her reference doing stuff about AI models, about cloud compute, about biotechnology. All of that stuff has not really been addressed yet from BIS. So it was really striking, and I would be shocked if sort of chip war didn't also end up making a number, at least a top 2 appearance on our recap December 2024.
Yeah, I think that's right. And if I could add one more dimension to this might be a bit esoteric, but I think your China-focused audience will really appreciate this. One of the biggest fear from the Chinese tech AI community is this Sun Zi Bingfa, this like art of war strategy called Wei SanQue Yi, which is that the traditional military tactic is that when you siege a city or a castle, you don't want to siege the entire place all for dimension. You always leave an opening, and that's actually the best way to defeat your enemy, because you give your enemy a wavering choice that maybe they can escape, maybe they cannot escape, but they're not going to fight back. They might surrender. If you kind of just surround the entire city, they will fight back more ferociously than ever because they have no other choice, and that actually makes the war much more costly, and you might actually end up losing even though you were in a better spot. And I think if the US sanctions become increasingly harder, if Secretary Raimondo really does, cut off the next derivative product from NVIDIA the very next day, as she likes to say it, she's basically committing a huge strategic error by sealing off the entire city or country of China from being able to access alternatives and leaving a strategic opening so that they do not kind of put all of their chips on Huawei's ecosystem, which there are already signs that they're doing that. We already know that, Baidu and other large cloud vendors are now switching their focus to acquiring Huawei's Ascend GPU series, and kind of just gave up on any future possibility of getting NVIDIA's even like derivative products. And that, I think, is a huge strategic mistake that I do not think anyone in the US government either appreciates or really understands. So maybe brushing up on some, art of war wouldn't be such a bad idea when we think about what the next step of the Raimondo law may become.
All right, I'm gonna hit you with another Chengyu, which is a sort of inverse. Po fu chenzhou. It means like break the pots and sink the boats. I think this is like a Sangua one where basically like the army was right at the riverbed and the general like burned his ship so that
there's no escape route. There's no going
escape
back.
route. And you had to fight. You had to fight as hard as possible. And I feel like I don't actually think this is what the Chinese government is doing. But when you look at stuff like banning Hugging Face, limiting the access of sort of Western models, I think they banned ChatGPT really early on. Like there is there's also an aspect of the Chinese government trying to sort of like force its ecosystem, its like broad technological ecosystem to not be able to do the playbook that you had in the 90s and 2000s and 2010s, where you could just rely on Western stuff for like a big part of your tech stack. And I think like the sort of the almost more natural way like for Chinese developers to go out is to build applications on top of all of these foundational models, particularly if OpenAI is like still just going to be the best for the next few years going forward. Having to do both steps of the sort of foundational model generation as well as the application layer stuff is just like harder, but by making the firms not have another opportunity if they want to be able to reap the gains that AI potentially is putting on the table, then you are doing a little bit of pofu chunzhou to yourself as Beijing is thinking about tech competition over the next decade.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things to that, maybe. I think whether it's Wei Sanque or Pofu Chenzhou, I do think if China were to be in that state, if not already, it has to do probably more with U.S. sanctions and the increasingly larger yard and higher fence, despite the original characterization of the policy that is happening. And one just nuance, at least is my personal take on the blocking of Hugging Face. First of all, I think OpenAI ChatGPT decided to not do business in China or make it available in China initially when it was released.
It was really funny. It was like this, it was like within a week, like the Chinese government said we're banning this, but I think OpenAI broke up with China before China broke up with OpenAI.
That's exactly right. OpenAI decided to preemptively broke up with China before China could even say credibly that I'm breaking up with you, right? So that's one sort of like factual thing to insert in there. And coming back to Hugging Face, which it still perplexes me to a certain extent. Honestly, we'll see how this one goes. My personal theory is that Hugging Face doesn't just host models, it also hosts a bunch of data sets and benchmarks as a necessary component, right, to train any sort of machine learning algorithm, not just, large generative AI, large language models. And if you go through some of those just data sets, I think they're just data or facts or information in there that are, let's just say, inconvenient to be accessible in the Chinese regulatory or legal ecosystem. And I think that is probably the reason, not so much the models themselves, that trigger the block, at least right now, which you can distinguish from GitHub not being blocked, because GitHub just hosts code, right? These are just tools and logics. There's no quote unquote information in there that would become problematic in, again, the very unique Chinese political and social regulatory ecosystem. So that's my sort of very tiny needle threaded take on why Hugging Face is blocked and not GitHub.
So I got like a very low probability 2024 call for you. So if we end up in a world where OpenAI stays number one, Google's a clear number 2, and then you just have this like long morass of your Kimmies and your Anthropics and your Amazons of the world, like Sundar. Let's not forget Mr. Dragonfly. The guy was really into potentially getting back into the game in the PRC, and like we'll see what Secretary Raimondo has to say about this if she does end up sort of blocking exports of models. But there's nothing on the books now to stop Western firms from exporting, API access or what have you to Chinese companies. So, if Google gets desperate enough to, if it is a real winner take all market, but Google's a clear number 2, maybe they'll end up, making a sort of like a CAC compatible algorithm that they can, use to try to take over the Chinese market. I put that one at like 2 to 3%, but we'll see.
That's where the alpha comes from, is to be right on the 2 to 3%, right?
All right.
So I actually have a couple of things if we want to move into 2024 real quick that I think will be interesting to look at. One is Huawei's investing in open source AI development ecosystem, actually. So one news item that I wish more people talked about is Huawei becoming the first premier member from China, at least, in the PyTorch Foundation. PyTorch is kind of the open source developer architecture ecosystem to NVIDIA's CUDA, and basically. It initially came out of Meta. Now it's an open source foundation, and Huawei became the first premium member from China to really invest in this ecosystem. And specifically in the blog post, it said Huawei wants to, work with the PyTorch ecosystem to make Ascend, its GPU series, more accessible, to grow its developer traction, developer mindshare. And that, I think, is a very underrated strategy beyond the hardware itself that Huawei is investing in to grow its accessibility, right? Like grow its developer ecosystem, what I think is important to look at. And the other one that I'll just throw out in there, since I'm now more in the capital markets now, I'm doing investing full time, is Xi'an's IPO. Possibly, right? Coming back to how none of these things that we wanted to ban are being banned. Xi'an is working on a US IPO, and also Zeekr, which is Zeekr, which is the Chinese EV maker, a subsidiary of Geely, is also actually working on a US IPO, possibly as early as February of 2024. So, and the larger context being the US IPO market has actually been really shitty this entire year, and could see a revival next year. That's what a lot of investors are hoping for, to unlock more liquidity into the public market. Maybe it will have to be some of these Chinese companies actually kick it off, as opposed to some American companies, because Wall Street is kind of desperate for IPO deals and IPO business. So we'll see what happens with these two.
So I think the one story for me for 2024 is the obvious one, which is going to be the election. We don't know who the GOP nominee is. Let's say 80% it's going to be Trump. Even if it's not a sort of Haley or a DeSantis administration, I think is going to, high probability they'll take a much harder stand on China than you've seen in the past. Trump is going to be a real wild card. I think we have a pretty good sense of what he would do to immigrants, what he would do to the media, what he would do to the deep state. But we saw a lot of different variants of Trump policy towards China over the course of administration, to a sort of very mainstream Republican circa 2007, like corporate interests come first, all the way to super hawk, sort of far, particularly in a rhetorical perspective, beyond anything that the U.S. has ever seen post Tiananmen. So, what that is going to do in the lead up to the campaign is probably not a lot, because I think it's clear that China isn't interested in escalation, at least for the time being. But if Trump wins, we're going to be in a brave new world on many, many different fronts, U.S.-China relations and tech relations in particular, most definitely included. So I am not looking forward to doing podcasts about what a 2025 Trump administration would do for the world. But I guess, this is kind of a public service here. I'm now the last China podcast left standing, which is sort of, I don't know, scary, I guess. But
great power, great responsibility, Jordan. That's what I would say. Great power, great responsibility. And I hope you do have a U.S. election episode come October 2024 after both conventions, after the two nominees, whoever they may be, deliver their acceptance speech, because I'm pretty sure there will be a few China paragraphs in those acceptance speeches to parse out.
All right. I'm going to try to do fewer emergency pods next year. I feel like it got my eye off the prize, but I'll make an exception for the U.S. presidential election. Kevin Xu, thank you so much for being part of China Talk.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Still coming down from yesterday. Swimming in the smoke is a debt that I gotta pay. It's not a war if you never agree to play. Bring another round, gotta wash these tears away. And I know I run away, and I drink to hide the pain. And we know we gotta wait, we are fit for better days. But I don't wanna talk, no, I don't wanna talk no more. Cause it's getting me down, yeah, it's getting me down. Cause it's getting me down. Yeah, I just wanna move my wrist, do a body roll. Cause we don't give a shit. Wanna move my wrist, do a body roll. Cause we don't give a shit. Shout at the people we love the most. 9 to 5 for the suits on the 100th floor. Live in the basement, hanging on to high hope. And people get away, and rent's a bitch to pay. I lay in bed awake, and I know I see better days. I just wanna move my wrist, do a body roll, cause we don't give a shit. Wanna move my wrist, do a body roll, cause we don't give a shit. Cause I feel like this. Cause I feel like this.
Half a world away, feels a little further every day. Why can't we talk? Save some for me. Rest on my arm here. Talk like everything is gonna work itself out. Words like one thing, looks like another. But I just want it to be. Why is it we can't be? I just want us to be together. But I just want it to be. Why is it we can't be? I just want us to be together. Together. just wanted to be. Why is it we can't be? I just wanted to be together.